Kia ora koutou. I'll make that 12 o'clock now, so we'll get started as more people join us. Thank you for attending this lunchtime for our open Zoom on our annual advice on New Zealand ETS settings. Called Charlie Keeling aho. I'm a senior advisor in the communications and engagement team at the Commission, and I'll shortly explain how the session is going to run today. But first, I'm going to ask Matt to lead us into this session with a karakia.
Thanks, Charlie. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa pounamu te moana. Hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai. Tātou ia tātou, hui e, tai ki e. May peace be widespread. May the sea be like greenstone, a pathway for us all today. Let us show respect for one another, binding us all together.
Kia ora, Matt. Thank you for that. So before we get started, could you please share your name and organisation or community you represent into the chat while I'm just explaining how the session's going to run. And let us know where you're joining us from today. It's always good to see who we have on these open Zooms. This is our second session for this year, so we really appreciate you joining us and continuing your support. During this session, you'll be hearing from our Principal Analysts and Project Leads, Eva Murray and Matthew Smith, on the advice we'll be delivering on the NZ ETS unit limits and price control settings. After hearing from Matt and Eva, you'll have the opportunity to get your questions answered. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type your questions throughout. And we might not have time to cover all the questions during the session, but we'll get to as many as we can. And feel free to use the chat if you would like to speak to each other or share any resources. Just want to let you know as well that we are recording this session, so if you know anyone who isn't able to make it, they'll be able to watch this on our website afterwards. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Eva to kick us off.
Okay, I just need to organise to share my screen. Give me a second. Charlie, does that look okay? Is the presentation showing?
Yeah, that looks perfect. Excellent.
So we'll get started then. So as Charlie's just mentioned, I'm co-leading with Matthew Smith this work that the Commission is currently doing on NZ ETS unit limits and price control settings. And just to give you just a preview of what we'll be covering today, we'll just be going over some initial material just about the role of the Climate Change Commission, some basics about emissions trading, before we get into kind of the more specific information about this piece of advice that we're working on at the moment. And in terms of what we're talking about today, we're talking really about what this advice is and the issues that we're considering. Of course, you know, we're still working on this advice, and it will be the middle of the year before we can actually tell you what it might be, you know, what the recommendations will be, because we're still in the midst of this work. Then we'll give you a bit of an idea about what the timeline and the next steps in this process of advising on ETS settings is, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. But please do fire through your questions in the Q&A box in the Zoom chat, not the chat, the Q&A box, and our colleagues will kind of make sure that these questions get asked. So just to give an overview of the Climate Change Commission's role, I'm sure most people on the webinar, in the webinar audience, already knows this, but just to recap, we were established by the passing of the Zero Carbon Act in 2019, and we have quite, you know, a varied set of roles. The first piece of advice we delivered was last year, which was recommending emissions budgets and the direction of policy that the government, you know, needed to consider in delivering on those emissions budgets. So that's advice. That was advice on the first emissions reduction plan. But you know, we do have other functions that are now kicking in, and one of those is this advice on NZ ETS unit limits and price control settings. But in general, all of our roles are centred around providing independent evidence-based advice on how the government should address climate change and transition to a low emissions and climate resilient Aotearoa. So, we will continue over time, periodically coming back to advice on emissions budgets and emission reduction plan, as this is a cycle that needs to go through every few years. But we are now starting our new work program on all these other functions that we have related to adaptation, monitoring the government's progress in meeting emissions budgets and implementing emission reduction plans, and then also some of these more specific pieces of advice, for example, this NZ ETS advice, and also there's some other advice that we're working on right now about agricultural emissions. And just to be aware, we are just one part of the broader climate change policy system. So we are, we have a specific role, and other organisations such as the Ministry for the Environment, the Ministry for Primary Industries, the Ministry of Business and Employment, MB, they also continue to have roles, and they're the lead for detailed policy development and implementation. And of course, we have the government and the Minister for Climate Change, and they're the ones who make the decisions, where we provide advice, and that advice is part of the matters they consider when they make decisions about climate policies. So just where this ETS advice fits in, it's annual advice that we'll be giving every year from now on. We're taking on this function once the emissions budgets have been put in place. But the ETS, and this advice is quite focused and quite specific. There's a very specific guidance in the legislation about what we must deliver. But just to be aware that we'll be giving other advice in future where broader issues related to the ETS and other climate change policies, where those issues will be considered. So as well as this annual advice on ETS unit limits and price control settings, towards the end of next year, we'll be giving advice to the government on the direction of policy for the second emission reduction plan. So that's where the ETS fits in the broader suite of climate policies, and other issues about making the ETS work as well as it can might fit in. Then from mid-2024, we'll be required to deliver our first statutory monitoring report on the government's progress towards emissions budgets and the implementation of the first emission reduction plan. And also, just to note, we do also have a function of providing advice on increasing or decreasing the phase-out rates for industrial allocation. This only kicks in if we're requested to do this by the minister, and we haven't received a request yet, but that could be something that happens in future. So yeah, just to be aware, as well as this current advice we're working on, there is other advice coming up where the ETS is relevant. Now I'm just going to recap some basics about emissions trading, which again, many people will be familiar with, but it's useful to go over it to make sure, because it's a foundation for what's coming next. So basically what an emissions trading scheme does is make it more expensive to undertake emitting activities. And this makes it economically attractive to switch to lower emissions alternatives. Basically, it rebalances the way businesses make financial decisions to take into account the costs of climate change and of meeting targets. An analogy that's sometimes been used to describe how it works is that it's a bit like musical chairs. The government provides a limited amount of units into the market, and these units each represent a tonne of greenhouse gas emissions, of CO2 equivalent. So this limited amount of units, it's like the chairs in the game of musical chairs. This is the cap that sets the limit on emissions that are allowed by covered sectors. And there's not enough units to go around everyone, which gives them a value. They're traded in the market, and the emitters who find it hardest to reduce emissions will be willing to pay more for units, and those who can reduce more easily will do so rather than having to buy the units. And over time, the cap is reduced, incentivizing more emissions reductions as the emission price rises. And this system allows emitters flexibility to decide how best to reduce emissions and how to innovate, rather than the government mandating what they should do. So the advice we're talking about today, the unit limits in particular, is really about deciding how many units the government should put into the market. So if we look at this sort of basic illustrative graph on this slide, where you have projected emissions, and then you have a limit on emissions, which is that red dotted line, which is the path you need to take to meet your emission reduction target or your emissions budgets. And then there's the blue volume under that graph. And this advice, a lot of it is about how that blue volume is allocated into the ETS market, either, mainly how many units are auctioned into the market. So, and just quickly to touch on, of course, an ETS is just one policy. It is a really important tool that the government has at its disposal, but it needs to be part of a suite of policies. And this graph just illustrates that it's most useful in the area where there's commercially viable options to reduce emissions. So in this kind of graph of a MAC curve, it's really that middle zone where it's likely to have most effect. There are also other market failures in place that might block emission reductions being taken up. You can see this, for example, in energy efficiency, which is typically cost effective to do, but still people don't do it for a whole range of reasons. And other policies might be needed in that case. And those sorts of market failures can be across the whole range, even where there are this middle zone as well. And then where the technologies or options to reduce emissions don't exist, or they're very expensive, this is where you need research, development and deployment support to reduce costs and enable scale up and uptake of these new ways of doing things. And before we get into the specifics of this advice, I'd just point out that how the ETS in New Zealand fits into the policy framework we have for climate. With the passing of the Zero Carbon Act 2 or 3 years ago, we now have the 2050 target, which sets the overall direction of travel for where we want to get to. And then the emissions budgets and the nationally determined contribution, which is our sort of target under the Paris Agreement, these provide more tangible goals for the medium term. So this is out 15 years rather than 3 decades, which is what the 2050 target does. And then the ETS sits below these higher level goals. So it can be thought of as the messenger that transmits these goals to the economy over the shorter term. So the unit and price control settings that we're talking about today, they go out for 5 years. So they're the short-term signal. And the means that the ETS communicates to the economy these goals is really through the units that are supplied into the market. And I guess a key point to make with this slide and this diagram is that the NZ ETS is a tool. It's not a strategy in itself. It needs to be told what to do. And this is what the purpose of these high-level targets and also the government's emission reduction plan, that's the role that those strategies serve. So the way the ETS is run should mostly flow from decisions that have already been made about these emissions budgets, the 2050 target, the nationally determined contribution, as well as the government's emissions reduction plan. The ETS is just a servant of these higher level plans and strategies and goals. And this advice is about how the ETS, the main point of it is how the ETS can align behind the emissions budgets and the NDC set by the government. So to get into the more specifics, I'll hand over to Matt, who's going to talk for the next few slides.
Thanks, Eva. So I'm going to cover a bit about what recommendations we have to make and what they have to cover, and then a bit more detail on the first lot of those recommendations before passing back to Eva for more detail on the second set. So the two things that we have to provide advice on are recommendations on unit limits and recommendations on the price control settings. So the unit limits are a set of limits on the units that will be available by auction, any offshore units that will be available in the scheme, and an overall limit on units that includes units available by other means, particularly industrial allocation. And together, these limits set the total number of units that will be available kind of to the market through the auctioning mechanism. The second set of recommendations we need to make is around the price control settings. And so this is, first of all, an auction reserve price, a price floor below which the government won't auction any units, and a cost containment reserve. And the cost containment reserve is a reserve volume of units that will be released to the market at a particular trigger price or prices. We have to make recommendations about both the volume and the prices. On the next slide, our recommendations have to cover the next 5 years. So in the reformed ETS, there is always 5 years worth of volumes and price settings in place. And each year, a new year's worth of settings is added on to the end. There is a sliding scale of flexibility as you look further ahead. You can never change the settings of the year that you're currently in. You can change the immediate next 2 years in special circumstances, and the last 2 years that are currently in place get reviewed every year. This year, because it's the first time emission budgets are being set, and because the cost containment reserve has been triggered, we can put in new volume and price settings for the whole 5-year period. So our advice is going to cover 2023 to 2027. Some of the considerations that we have to have regard to are described here. The Climate Change Response Act lists a range of matters that we have to take account of. Section 5M lists matters that we have to have regard to in all our work where relevant. Section 30GC sets out matters specific to the unit limits and price control settings relating to emissions trading that we have to have regard to in this work specifically. In terms of what our recommendations look like, they're going to be a table of figures. And so they will follow this kind of format. So this is the settings that are currently in place. And as you can see, it's just a table of volume limits for each of the next 5 years, reserve and trigger prices for the next 5 years, and a volume for the cost containment reserve. Our figures will likely be different to these, but this is the kind of format that we will be providing. As well, we'll be providing a report that details our logic and thinking and provides the kind of supporting basis for our recommendations. I'm now going to talk a bit about the unit limits and the process that we go through to arrive at those. This is not the first time that this process has been done. MFE has done it for the last 2 years before the commission, either before the commission was established or before emission budgets are in place. Once the emission budgets are set at the end of May, responsibility for giving this advice transitions to us. We've had a look at MFE's method and think it's pretty good, although we might make some different judgments. So I'm just going to quickly step through how that works. The 6-step process, you have to, first of all, factor out emissions outside the ETS. You need to then make any technical or volume adjustments. MFE have not made any of those so far, but we may make some this year. We need to account for free NZU allocation volumes. This is largely industrial allocation. You then need to set your reduction volume to address unit oversupply. This is one of the bigger judgments involved in this work. Set the approved overseas unit limit, and then what remains is available to auction. And so on the next slide, we illustrate this graphically. So here, what this graph shows is essentially that process having been built up through a graph. So the solid dotted line is, it's currently, I believe, the provisional emissions budget. And so all these figures are based on last year's assessment, but it illustrates the process. So that solid line would be the emissions budget. Then there is some post-89 forestry that sits outside the NZ ETS that nonetheless contributes to meeting the target. And so that raises the bar to the dotted line. The grey line is our forecast gross emissions. And so the difference between the grey line and the dotted line is the abatement needed to meet the budgets. So you can see that the block of the blue at the bottom is your gross emissions sitting outside the ETS. Industrial allocation takes up some of that volume. And then there is a choice to make about how much and how fast to reduce the stockpile in the green, and then what's left is what's auctioned. Just a note on that stockpile. Currently, there is a large number of units banked within the scheme, over 150 million units. And to put that in context, this graph illustrates that against current annual surrender volumes. So the blue bars are the number of units banked in the scheme, and the orange is the number of units that need to be surrendered each year for the past 5 years. So it's about 4 years worth of surrenders that are currently sitting in the scheme. And for comparison, the government's consultation document on their emission reduction plan estimated that they would need 7.7 million tonnes worth of abatement to meet its first budget. So the number of units in the scheme is quite a lot larger than that abatement volume. So in terms of the issues that we're going to be addressing through this work, there are some technical issues in reconciling differences with how the ETS and the greenhouse gas inventory report emissions and how we adjust for changes in forecast emissions. We need to consider how the emissions budget treats emissions outside the ETS, particularly here considering how we factor in biogenic methane targets when the emission budgets are all gas. But the biggest issue in setting the volumes is by how much and how fast we aim to reduce the amount of banked units. This can be a problem because those units can come to market in place of emission reductions, lowering the price below what's needed to decarbonise. Now, a significant portion of that stockpile, however, will be being held for future forestry liabilities. So there's a question there about how much of the stockpile should be reduced and over what time period. And those are key questions we'll be considering in this work. The past units released from the cost containment reserve have also contributed to this. However, the stockpile existed before those cost containment reserve units were released. This does mean that the settings for the volumes need to be considered closely with how the cost containment reserve volumes and trigger prices are set to ensure that the two don't work against each other. And that segues neatly into the next section on the price control settings, which Eva will pick up.
Okay, so I'm just briefly going to go over the price control settings and the advice we need to give on these. To start, just to explain what these price control settings are, Matt's already mentioned it, but overall, their function in the scheme, according to when the government adopted this current framework for the ETS, the function of these price control settings was that they are intended to be safety valves that manage risks of price extremes, either excessively high prices or excessively low prices. And so we have both the cost containment reserve, which is kind of like a soft price ceiling on auctions. And we also have something called the auction reserve price, which is like a price floor on the auctions. So this graph here just shows the corridor that the current price control settings give in the ETS right now under the current regulations. So as you can see, for this year, the cost containment reserve is at $70, but it will be stepping up over time under the current regulations. And then the auction reserve price, which withholds units from auctions if the auctions clear below this auction reserve trigger price, that's at $30 with a more gradual step up over time. So, you know, you might ask, why has the government decided to put these price measures in the ETS? Why, you know, an emissions trading scheme, I think the typical sort of textbook explanation for it is that you set the volume of emissions and then you let the market find the price, as opposed to an emissions tax where you set the tax, you know, the tax level, and then you have less certainty about the emission reductions that you might receive. And I guess it's worth pointing out that every emissions trading scheme that exists in the world today is not a pure, you know, none of them are pure quantity-based instruments. All of them have some kind of market stability mechanisms in them that manage, you know, the volume of units that go in over time in response to various factors, including in response to price changes. So the New Zealand emissions trading scheme is not unusual in this regard. And yeah, the price controls that we have are sort of somewhat similar to some that exist in other markets, such as the Western Climate Initiative emissions trading scheme that exists in North America, in California and Quebec. But, you know, why would a government want to manage price extremes? The reasons for this, there are several reasons for this, including, you know, there's some benefits from having smooth and steady price development, because a really volatile emissions price increases the risk and therefore the cost of investing in emissions reductions. It provides some signaling to the market about what's needed to reduce emissions in line with targets. And there are also concerns around just transition, that avoiding the extreme impacts from extreme price rises can flow through to people and cause things like unemployment or hardship. And of course, there's also political considerations. It's worth thinking about, although ETSs are meant to be quantity-based instruments, you know, it is true that still, you know, most of the time people are always interested in what the price is going to be. So this is what we have at the moment. And just to provide a little bit more background about, you know, what we need to think about when we give this advice to update these price control settings. Here's just a little graph of what the NZU price has done in the secondary market over the last couple of years. So as you can see, there's been quite an upward trend. The price has increased quite significantly over a relatively short period of time, just a couple of years. And, you know, of course, there's a whole range of things that contribute to this. The ETS has gone through some quite significant reforms. New targets have been set. The new policy framework for climate has been adopted. So, you know, increasing prices makes sense. We now have much more clarity over what we need to do to meet our targets and understand that there's, you know, a significant effort involved in that. But also on the other hand is, you know, this upward price, you know, trend has caused it has affected the operation of these price controls, and it has triggered, you know, we started auctioning last year for the first time. Previously, the system wasn't really connected. The ETS wasn't really that very well connected with our emission reduction targets. And the introduction of these new price controls is part of, you know, trying to connect the ETS up to our targets in a better way. And as part of this, we started auctioning last year, and these new price control settings came in. And what we did see was that by the third auction of the year last year, the cost containment reserve was triggered. At that time, the cost containment reserve was set at $50, and it was already clear that that cost containment reserve needed to move to a higher level. So that's, you know, very understandable that it got triggered, but it did release quite a few units into the market. And then again, this year, we've just had the first auction of the year, and the cost containment reserve, which is now at $70, was triggered again. It wasn't fully released to the market, but most of the volume in the reserve was released. So this is something we need to think about in our advice. Is this cost containment reserve operating appropriately or as it should, given the prices we're seeing in the market? And I guess the other thing, and again, another thing in the mix is the, large amount of units that are currently in circulation in the market, more than 150 million, which, is a risk for the future in terms of how the ETS will be, to what extent the ETS will be able to support New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand, to meet its emission reduction targets. So in terms of the issues we're thinking about as we develop this advice, we need to consider both the auction reserve price and the cost containment reserve, but because the cost containment reserve has been triggered over the past few months, we certainly need to consider its design and operation. Some of the issues that we're thinking about are things like, both the trigger price and the reserve volume, which is sort of the two key components of how this cost containment reserve works. At the moment, we have a single trigger price. The legislation actually allows for more than one trigger price. So there could be, this reserve could be split up into tiers, different trigger prices. So that's something to consider. We need to think about the trajectory of the trigger prices over time. So according to that graph before, as you can see, it steps up over time. We need to consider whether it's at the right level. And we need to think about how market participants are responding to this new system that we have with these price controls. There is, an issue that is being raised that perhaps these, the cost containment reserve trigger prices acting as an anchor for market participants' price expectations. So that's something we need to think about. In terms of the reserve volume that is in the cost containment reserve, we need to think about how that volume is set, including its relationship to this large amount of banked units that's in the market, and the stockpile reduction volume that might be implemented to reduce the amount of units that are auctioned. And we also need to think about, how this, if the cost containment reserve is released, what are the risks around that? And there is one risk in the legislation. There is a provision that sets out that, the minister and the government may need to back units from the cost containment reserve if they're released into the market. By backing, what we mean is the minister may have to obtain or fund emission reductions somewhere else outside the ETS or elsewhere from offshore. So it might involve purchasing offshore mitigation to make sure that these units, having been released, don't if they cause us to not meet our emissions budgets, that is made up for in some way. However, we'd just note this provision in the Act. It sort of talks about whether these units have caused the emission budget to be exceeded. So that is something that there's some questions around what that actually means and how that would work. And we'd only know, of course, if the emissions budget had been exceeded after the end of the emission budget period. So this is an issue to think about in terms of future risks rather than necessarily right now. So those are some of the issues where we need to analyse and understand. And before we sort of launch into the question and answer session, I'll just give you a bit of a sense of what's coming up next and what the timeline for this advice is and the process for considering this advice. So in terms of us being able to finalise our advice, we are only able to do that, of course, after the government has set its emissions budgets and emission reduction plan. And so the deadline for the government doing that is the 31st of May. So we can only give advice after that. So tentatively at the moment, we are planning on delivering our advice in the first half of July. So that's when our deadline is likely to be. So at the moment, we're doing as much work as we can to get ready for the government's emissions budgets being finalised. So we're working off the provisional emissions budgets that the government has put out. We're doing a whole lot of background technical work to look at emissions forecasts and how the ETS is relating to the inventory. We are also engaging with a range of market participants and organisations and relevant people to build up our understanding of what is happening in the ETS market, and seeking a range of different views on these settings, how they work, how they could work, and what might be appropriate in terms of the advice that we have to give in July. So we're pretty busy, although we will get even busier once the emission budgets comes out. There's going to be a pretty busy phase right at the end of this process. And I would just note that we're not consulting publicly on this advice. We're not doing a formal public consultation process with submissions. And this is because that once our advice is delivered to the minister, the government will have to go through a process of considering this advice. And as part of that, it is actually required to undertake consultation. So there is already a public consultation sort of planned for the second half of the year on the proposed settings, and that will be led by MFE on behalf of the minister. So from our perspective, we sort of decided not to consult and that we would undertake engagement instead. So this is a less formal process, but where we seek to discuss and meet with a whole range of different people rather than have a formal submissions process. And that's also partly because of timeline considerations. This is a relatively tight timeline for getting this advice done. And also, we felt that two consultation processes may generate consultation fatigue among all the different people who might be interested in this topic. So we've gone down the route of undertaking engagement rather than formal consultation. But there will be a consultation, and that's in the second half of this year. Exactly when is not entirely clear yet, and it's a sort of a decision for the minister and the Ministry for the Environment. But there will be an opportunity to formally submit views on what these settings should be. And then by December this year, final policy decisions have to be taken by the government, and the regulations have to be finalised and put in place before they enter into force January next year for the 2023 to 2027 period. And I'd just point out this timeline this year, we will be giving this advice every year, but this year, this timeline is a little bit different from what it will be in future years. This is simply because we have to wait for the emissions budgets to be set. In future years, all of this will happen a little bit earlier. We'll probably be delivering our annual advice on these settings around probably February, March or April, around then, and then the consultation will be by MFE will be earlier as well, and the regulations normally have to be finalised in September. So that's just something to be aware of in terms of the timeline. But that's probably enough from me, and I think it's probably time to move into the question and answer phase of the webinar.
Yep, thank you both for the presentation, and we have got quite a few questions that have come through, so we'll get straight into it. The MFE 6-step process is focused only on the domestic budgets and not the NDC. How will you modify that process to meet the Climate Change Response Act requirement that limits and price control settings are in accordance with emissions budgets and the NDC? And we've also had a related question around the ETS and the NDC target as well. So.
Thanks. I can pick this one up. So bluntly, right now we can't. The government has indicated that offshore mitigation is going to form a part of meeting the NDC, and that is part of the government's role to decide how the NDC will be met. And so while the NDC and the emissions budgets are at different levels, and we don't have access to offshore mitigation just yet, then these volume settings cannot align with both of those. There is provision in the Act that the Minister does not have to align the settings exactly if there is good reason. And I think we would consider that the current lack of access to offshore mitigation would meet that standard. When the government does get access to offshore mitigation, there is part of that can be put in through the ETS, or it could be done in other ways. If the government wants to, then there is scope in this process to align with both of those through a separate limit on offshore mitigation, and that is one of the volume limits we have to advise on.
Thanks, Matt. We've got a couple of related questions here, so I'll ask these ones together as well. If emissions are reduced through early action and many industries decarbonise independent of ETS price, would this result in a reduction of ETS price? And the similar question, is there a requirement for the unit limit to be adjusted for voluntary emissions reducing activities? Or is it just considered that there is a casual but indirect relationship between the existence of the cap and these behaviours?
I might pick up the first one and then let Eva address the voluntary question. Yes, if there are emission reductions through other measures, then that would likely reduce the ETS price. It also means that over time, because we're doing this process every year, that we can lower the cap to take account of emissions that are reduced. Eva, did you want to comment on how voluntary action interacts here?
Yeah, so those who are sort of following the voluntary market at the moment will be aware that it's kind of in a state of change at the moment, because how the voluntary market will work with the introduction with the Paris Agreement, which works in quite a different way from the Kyoto Protocol, this is all still being worked out. What I can say is that the mechanism that has existed in the past, whereby an NZU can be cancelled and an AAU cancelled at the same time, so an adjustment made against New Zealand's targets to account for that cancellation of an NZU, that will no longer exist in the ETS very shortly. So there is no mechanism to kind of really guarantee that cancelling an NZU will not be double claimed against New Zealand's targets. And I guess what I can point people to is the government has recently published guidance on the voluntary market, which is interim guidance at the moment, recognising that the voluntary market is kind of evolving with time. And that sort of points out that, to be very cautious in terms of thinking about cancelling NZUs for the purposes of voluntary mitigation, because you need to think about the claim that you're making when you do that. And at the moment, there isn't a mechanism to ensure that cancellation is not double claimed against New Zealand's national targets. So yeah, and it also points out that most NZUs are not suitable for this use for voluntary offsetting or mitigation purposes. So I'd point you to that guidance to read and think about that if you're thinking about voluntary mitigation, but I would point out that there is no mechanism to guarantee that double claiming doesn't occur. And maybe that's not what you care about in terms of undertaking voluntary mitigation, but you need to be very careful about the claim that you're making around that voluntary mitigation activity if it involves cancelling NZUs. It may mean that making claims around carbon neutrality can't be backed up, but other claims potentially could be made, for example, about assisting New Zealand to meet its targets in better ways with more native forestry or something like that. Yeah, hopefully that helps.
Thank you both. For planning purposes, are there recommended ETS prices that companies could use as an estimate of the 2030 ETS price?
No. So we will be providing advice on the price control settings, which are sort of indicative bounds, but they shouldn't really be taken as sort of what the price will be, and they won't extend out to 2030. Eva, did you have anything more you want to add on that?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. So the price control settings in the ETS do provide a sort of a signalling role, and the ones that are in the scheme at the moment were informed by analysis that has been done on the costs of abatement for meeting New Zealand's or Aotearoa's emission reduction targets. And so they are informed by modelling that was done for emissions budgets that sort of indicated that the cost of abatement that we might need to be facing in 2030 is around $140 in real prices. But as Matt said, that is not an ETS price forecast. That is sort of an estimate of what the actions that that need to be taken within the economy, what those actions might cost, what the marginal cost of doing the things to reduce emissions might be. So what price will arise in the ETS can actually be very different from that, and that depends on a whole range of factors. It depends on the other policies that the government implements to reduce emissions. There could be significant other policies that bring that cost down, and so the ETS price might be lower. There are also, the market can operate in unusual ways, and prices can increase due to, for example, increase or decrease due to, for example, geopolitical conditions. And we've seen that recently, with the war in Ukraine has impacted the cost of emissions in ETSs around the world, not just here, but it's had a very dramatic, quite a dramatic effect in Europe, although, there was a big drop and now it's crept, the price of in the EU ETS is now crept back up to closer to where it was before. So I wouldn't say that there are any forecasts of the ETS price, but there is information out there about how much it's likely to cost to reduce emissions in New Zealand. And that is one of the factors that you can think about in terms of understanding where the price might go. But yeah, really caution against using that as a forecast of the ETS price. Yeah, hopefully that helps a little bit. And also, yeah, we would just point out that these settings are a range. So, it's not a forecast or a prediction. They're meant to provide a corridor within which the market finds the price. And of course, they don't prevent the secondary market from trading above or below that range either. These controls work by influencing how auctions operate.
Thank you both. We've had a couple of questions on this particular one, but can you explain in a bit more detail the stockpile reduction volume and how this is set?
Sure. So we have currently a bit over 150 million units sitting in the scheme. Each one can be surrendered for a ton of emissions. A lot of those units are there because of how the scheme used to work before it was reformed, when it did not have a cap, and it had sort of an unlimited amount of units that could flow into the scheme through different mechanisms. So there is a bit of a job to do to analyse how much of that quantity of banked units represents an oversupply to be addressed. Part of that quantity will be being held for future forestry liabilities. So forests that are in the ETS on the stock change approach will have generated units as they grew, but will have to repay those units when they're harvested. And we're coming up to a period where there will be a lot of harvesting, so a lot of those units will be surrendered for those forests, and so they won't really allow for greater gross emissions. So there's some analysis that we need to do to assess how much that component is. There is then also a certain amount of banked units that represent a useful quantity for a functioning scheme. So you may want businesses to have enough units to be able to hedge a certain time frame ahead. So taking account of both of those things, there is probably still a significant oversupply. When MFE looked at this last year, they did some analysis and assessed that the oversupply was, they said it was 54 million units, and they planned to reduce that by reducing auction volumes by 5.4 million units each year for 10 years. Now we're going to have another look at that analysis and make some recommendations on that again.
Thank you, Matt. Will all of your analysis and advice be released publicly?
I
Oh,
can answer that question. The report, the advice that we give to the minister, that will be a series of recommendations with the report, outlining the rationale for those recommendations. So as with all of the Commission's reports, that will have to be made publicly available shortly after it's submitted to the minister. Generally, that will happen within about 2 weeks of our advice being given to the minister, when the minister has to table that report in Parliament. So that will rapidly become publicly available, and we will, no doubt publish, a lot of the analysis that supports that report. I just note that with the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme, there are some legislated rules about the sort of data that can be published or which must be kept confidential, and there may be some of the data that we use in our analysis that may not be able to be published because of these rules. So that's just something to note. But as always, we will try and make as much of our analysis as transparent and publicly available as possible.
thank you, Eva. How do you respond to the arguments by some economists that any reductions in one part of the ETS are replaced by others under the ETS? I think they call it the waterbed effect.
So that is the argument that an ETS with a fixed cap, where you have reductions in emissions in one part, that frees up units elsewhere. There are two arguments here. The first is we do not have a fixed cap, so we can adjust the cap each year through this advice. Where there are reductions in one part of the ETS, if emissions are being reduced more quickly than we expect, we can lower the cap to account for that, to ensure that we still get the other emission reductions that we were expecting to incentivize. That's the main argument, really.
Thanks, Matt. Is there a risk that low CCR trigger levels might lead to large levels of banked units?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Is there a risk that low CCR trigger levels might lead to large levels of banked units?
If the CCR trigger level was set too low, then the cost containment reserve volumes would contribute to the banked units, as it has. It is contributing to a bigger problem, is what I would say. And so, yes, that is something we need to consider when we are making recommendations about the trigger prices and the volumes.
And one thing, I would add to that is that there are other things that we need to consider as well, in terms of potential adjustments to any of these settings. One thing we need to keep in mind is the importance of regulatory predictability for market participants. So any potential changes to the settings that have been put in place already, we need to think about, people have already been planning on these settings, and it is quite a big decision to change them. So, and regulatory predictability and having clear rules for the market is also very important, and something that we need to think about in terms of all of these issues to do with how the settings might change over time. Because, as I think we've seen from the history of the New Zealand's emissions trading scheme and from emissions trading schemes overseas, is that, if there are, that predictability and clear rules for the scheme are really important for enabling the people in the market, the businesses who are affected by the emissions price, to be able to make, understand what the rules are and make good decisions about how they manage their obligations and how they reduce emissions over time. So that's also a factor that will be, considered in our advice.
Both. I've got 5 minutes left, so we've probably got time for 1 or 2 more questions. We'll see how we go with this first one. But how are you considering the impact of the emissions price on people, households and businesses?
Thanks, Charlie. We are looking at that quite carefully. So we are analysing the impact on households of a range of different prices, doing some updated analysis to look at those direct effects, and we're also looking at the analysis that we did through our tonu nei on the price impacts on communities and businesses, and we're also interested in talking to people about that as well.
Thanks, Matt. We'll try and squeeze 1 more in then, and before we wrap up. Could you please expand on how you account for changes to forestation and sequestration on the unit limits as the carbon prices move around?
So kind of what I would say to that at the moment, just to make sure that it's clear, because we may not have said this too clearly in the presentation, that these settings that we're advising on are kind of the architecture for the settings that's already in the legislation at the moment, and this doesn't include levers to control forestry or control the amount of afforestation that occurs. So it's not really about determining the amount of or type of abatement that comes through in the economy at the moment. I mean, that is something that the government is looking at the moment. It's something that the Climate Change Commission, in our advice on emissions budgets and the emission reduction plan in Ngāi tonu nei last year, said to the government that it's something to think about, how the ETS works and how all of our policies work together to make sure that we get reductions in gross emissions rather than a very large amount of forestry, because we do have a large potential for forestry in New Zealand. So I would just sort of clarify that this advice doesn't really have any levers in it to allow forestry to be controlled, although that's something to be looked at in the future development of the ETS. So yeah, but how, in terms of how the ETS is operating, of course, we need to think about the amount of forestry that's registered in the scheme versus what's not in the scheme, and how those unit flows might occur over time, including, the units that may be surrendered by foresters as they harvest their trees if they're on the stock change accounting methodology. So we do need to think about forestry as part of this work, but this work is not really, this advice is not really directed at controlling forestry, if that helps.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. We've only got a couple more minutes to go, so we'll wrap up now. And I just want to say thank you so much to both of you for taking us through this work today, and to all of you that have joined and shared your questions. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And I'm just going to hand over to Matt now to close the session for us with a karakia.
Thanks, Charlie. Whakataka te ho ki te uru, whakataka te ho ki te tonga. Kia makina kina ki uta, kia mataratara ki tai. Ehi aki ana te ata kura, he tio, he huka, he hohonga, tihei Moriora.
Thank you, everyone.